Okay, our next question is, do some countries have more power in the United Nations than others, such as with the Security Council veto? And can this and should this be changed?
Good question. I think we often focus on the Security Council because you do have, it's a 15-member committee, and there's 5 members that have vetoes on that. So China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And you say, well, why those countries? Well, those were the ones that won the war, effectively. Yeah. So you've got within the Security Council a veto power amongst some countries that historically played a role in shaping that. It might be that a person could say, well, they are generally major powers. Maybe France and England less so now. Maybe we should bring in some other large powers to have a kind of a veto. I think a case could be made for that. On the other hand, if there's too many countries with a veto, then of course nothing gets done. And often these larger players have interests where, you'd want security actions being taken, but it goes against their economic interests. So look at Syria now, and the fact that some of the larger players, Russia has historically had ties with Syria and is not particularly keen with seeing a UN intervention there. On the other hand, where there are countries where none of the major players have serious stakes, often I think the UN can move in. So there's that, and the question might be too, if you ended up trying to compel large countries to do various sorts of things without them having some kind of a clout within that space, would they buy into the UN as an enterprise? And would they allow those types of security interventions to occur? I think the other thing too is recognizing that would it be a better thing if the UN could just very quickly intervene, where you had some kind of power base that just almost automatically would intervene like a government would in a country. And again, the kinds of problems that you're dealing with at the UN level, I think the UN would often say, well, it's the government's responsibility to sort out militarily and policing within its own territory, and it's those gray areas that we need to then deal with. But they're gray areas, and the question is, do you need to have a considerable amount of deliberation and actual public pressure on some of those countries that have been thinking about vetoing something to actually have a legitimate international intervention, and not just legitimate legally, but legitimate in terms of the global community, in terms of the public mind, whatever that happens to be. And so even on Syria, I think Russia is now making moves that's taken a lot of bloodshed for that to happen, but it's not clear to me that a rapid intervention right off the bat would have necessarily resolved on the long term the conflict, right? I mean, that's the question. Maybe there is that inequality at that level could be helpful, but maybe it doesn't have the right players. On the other hand, there's a lot of other inequalities in terms of how the UN treats countries, so you often have very small countries perhaps having much greater say and vote power, right? Think of a small country having the same number of votes as the United States, right? Mm-hmm. Why should they be given that amount of representation? And is it a good thing? Well, I think it is a good thing. I think in the long run, an idea of strict equality doesn't recognize the value of the autonomous powers of smaller countries to make their own decisions. And I think in terms of political philosophy, there is an advancement over, a traditional idea of strict equality actually being fair. And so the idea that we have to keep in mind that, developed countries have a much greater capacity to address certain types of problems given their wealth. And in many cases, those developed countries created a lot of those problems. So if you think of something like climate change, we've been generating CO2 emissions in Canada, the US, the industrial nations, for a much longer time period than these developing countries that are only just on the scene. Do we have a responsibility for all of that carbon we already put up? into the atmosphere? Would it be fair to treat everybody equally given our history in the area of, say, climate and industrialization? So I think the idea that we can have good reason for having imbalances of power that actually are fair. That's an odd answer, but I think that we can make that case.
Okay.